The Middle Republic, 264 to 133 BC, the first two Punic Wars. Rome's rapidly expanding sphere of hegemony brought it almost immediately into conflict with non-Italian powers. In the south, the main opponent was Carthage. In violation of the Treaty of 306, which, historians tend to believe, had placed Sicily in the Carthaginian sphere of influence, Rome crossed the Straits of Messina, between Italy and Sicily, embarking on war. Rome's wars with Carthage are known as the Punic Wars. The Romans called the Carthaginians Poni, Phoenicians, from which derived the adjective Punic. First Punic War, 264 to 241 BC. Carthage had long enjoyed treaties with Rome. The earliest known, which probably dated from the first year of the Roman Republic, as Polybius believed, 508 or 507 by his reckoning, may well have renewed previously made contacts with Etruscan Rome. Such agreements to limit the spheres of interest of the two parties would readily be renewed by Rome, which in the 5th and 4th centuries had no great interest in what went on outside Italy and had no objection to the merchants of Carthage dominating the western Mediterranean. When Rome enrolled some of the Greek cities of South Italy as naval allies, a new situation was created, since these cities had trading interests that the farmers of Latium had not enjoyed. Further, the Greek cities in Sicily, especially Syracuse, were being hard-pressed by the Carthaginians in the west and center of the island, while the Syracusans under Hieron II were challenged by the Mamertines, Italian mercenaries who had seized Messana and were plundering northeastern Sicily. The Mamertines appealed to both Rome and Carthage for assistance, and the Carthaginians, unwilling to see Messana and control of the Sicilian straits fall into Hieron's hands, established a Punic garrison in the town. The Romans, who themselves had expelled another company of mercenaries from Reggio, in the toe of Italy, captured the Carthaginian commander while under a flag of truce and compelled the Punic force to withdraw. Thus Rome and Carthage were brought face to face across the straits, and a crisis was precipitated by the appeal by Messana. Although some senators hesitated, the Roman people largely supported war with Carthage. Both Rome and Carthage were eager to deny to the other control of the straits, and, even if war had been avoided at this point, it would probably have come in time. A balance of power, such as that which the Hellenistic monarchies in the East, with longer diplomatic experience and a common culture, tried to maintain, was more difficult to achieve in the West, when the Romans, with Hieron, had occupied eastern Sicily and captured Agrigentum. They were faced with a decision that fundamentally affected their future history. If they decided to try to drive the Carthaginians completely out of Sicily, they would have to smash the Punic navy, and, since they had virtually no ships of their own, they would have to build a fleet. However, they were practical as well as determined, and before long they had over 100 ships ready. More surprising was the success that attended this fleet when it first went into action off Milazzo, in 260 and defeated an enemy with centuries of seafaring experience. After this victory, the Romans in 256 boldly sent an expeditionary force to Africa to attack Carthage itself, but this daring adventure under Marcus Attalus Regulus ended in failure. The war dragged on in Sicily, where the Carthaginians were gradually confined to their western fortresses of Drepana, Trapani, and Lilybaeum, Marsala. When their fleet was finally defeated off the Egadi Islands in 241, they capitulated. By the terms of the settlement, they agreed to evacuate Sicily as well as to pay Rome an indemnity. But they remained an independent power. Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BC. During the decades between the wars, the Carthaginians had been busy building up an empire in Spain which would help to compensate for the loss of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. The foundations of this dominion were laid by Hamilcar Barca, who had shown great military ability as commander in Sicily during the last stages of the First Punic War. In 237 he crossed to Spain with his 9-year-old son Hannibal, who had been made to swear eternal hatred for Rome. He quickly occupied southern and eastern Spain and managed to dismiss a Roman protest over the expansion of the Punic frontier to the north. When Hamilcar died in 229/228 BC, he was succeeded by his son-in-law Hasdrubal, who established a new base at Carthago Nova, Cartagena. In 226 to 225, Hasdrubal made a treaty with the Romans, by which he agreed not to cross the Ebro River with an armed force, while the Romans possibly assured him that they would not interfere with his conquests south of the river. 100 miles south of the Ebro was the Iberian seaport of Saguntum, Sagunta, with which Rome had made an alliance. If this was negotiated before the Ebro Treaty, then presumably the alliance was virtually annulled by the agreement. If Rome accepted the alliance after 226, it infringed the spirit and perhaps the letter of the treaty. Thus, when Hannibal, who succeeded Hasdrubal in 221, decided to regard the conquest of Spain as only preliminary to an attack upon Italy, he could use Saguntum to provoke Rome to action. In 219, therefore, when he was ready to challenge Rome, he attacked Saguntum. Disregarding Roman protests, he finally took it after an 8-month siege. This rendered a rupture with Rome inevitable, while it set his own hands free for further advance. Even if he had not technically broken any agreement with Rome, Hannibal had deliberately provoked an incident which he knew would lead to war. For some time, Barcide policy in Spain had been essentially defensive in regard to Rome, but Hannibal now moved to the offensive, and Rome accepted the challenge. Apart from the unprovoked seizure of Sardinia, Rome's policy after the First Punic War had not been deliberately aggressive. The Gallic Wars were defensive in spirit, and the Illyrian campaigns were a necessary piece of police work. Rather, without pursuing deep-laid plans, Rome dealt with each situation as it arose. If Hannibal chose to question Roman interference in Spain, Rome was willing to face the consequences. Hannibal's decision to leave his base in Spain, cross the Alps, and invade northern Italy was crowned with success and culminated in a series of victories at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae. However, although he won over much of southern Italy, including Capua, he failed to break Rome's determination to fight on, and he failed to undermine the loyalty to Rome of the Latin cities and central Italy. Hence he had to cast his strategic net more widely. This attempt too failed. His ally, Philip V of Macedonia, achieved little. The revolt of Syracuse against Rome was soon crushed, and the defeat of the Scipios in Spain failed to result in the expulsion of the Romans from the peninsula. Hannibal's own movements and strength in Italy were checked by the delaying strategy of Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucosus, and the breakthrough to Italy by his brother Hasdrubal was foiled at the Metaurus. Finally, Rome produced a military genius in Scipio Africanus, who drove the Carthaginians from Spain, persuaded his reluctant countrymen to allow him to invade Africa, won such success there that Hannibal was recalled from Italy to save Carthage, and finally defeated Hannibal at Zama. By the terms of the peace, Carthage was left as an independent state but had to give up everything outside an area roughly equivalent to that of modern Tunisia, to surrender its fleet, and to pay an indemnity over a period of 50 years. The Numidian prince Massinissa, whose cavalry had rendered Scipio invaluable service at Zama, was rewarded with an increase of territory. As Rome's ally, he stood watch over his neighbor Carthage, which by the treaty with Rome was forbidden to make war on anyone in Africa without the permission of Rome, and any war at all outside Africa. The effects of the war on Rome and Italy, on the constitution, on economic and social life, on religion and thought were profound. And it proved to be a turning point not only for them but for the history of the whole ancient world. No contemporary power could endanger the existence of Rome. The Hellenistic monarchies of the East still flourished, but at Rome's touch they collapsed like a house of cards. German and other barbarian tribes in the north could threaten, and the emergent Parthian Empire beyond the Euphrates might at times appear menacing, but for centuries such dangers were held at arm's length. The establishment of Roman hegemony in the Mediterranean world, Roman expansion in the eastern Mediterranean. Just before the Second Punic War, Rome had projected its power across the Adriatic Sea against the Illyrians. As noted, Philip V of Macedonia in turn had joined the Carthaginians for a time during the war in an attempt to stem the tide of Roman expansion but had agreed to terms of peace with Rome's allies, the Aetolians, in 206 and then with Rome in the Peace of Phoenix of 205. Immediately after the Second Punic War, the Roman Senate moved to settle affairs with Philip, despite the war-weary Centuriate Assembly's initial refusal to declare war. Historians have debated Rome's reasons for this momentous decision, with suggestions ranging from a desire to protect Athenians and other Greeks from Philip out of Philhellenism to fear of a secret alliance between Philip and the Seleucid king Antiochus III. Yet these suggestions are belied by the fact that Rome later treated the Greek cities callously and that no fear is apparent in Rome's increasing demands on Philip and in its refusal to negotiate seriously with him through the course of the war. Rather, the Second Macedonian War, 200 to 196, fits the long pattern of Roman readiness to go to war in order to force ever more distant neighbors to submit to superior Roman power. In the winter of 200 to 199, Roman legions marched into the Balkans under the command of Publius Sulpicius Galba. During the next 2 years there was no decisive battle, as the Romans gathered allies among the Greeks, not only their previous allies, the Aetolians, but also Philip's traditional allies, the Achaeans, who recognized Roman military superiority. The consul of 198, Titus Quinctius Flamininus, took over the command and defeated Philip at the Battle of Cynocephaly in 197. The terms of settlement allowed Philip to remain king of Macedonia but stipulated payment of an indemnity and restrictions on campaigning beyond the borders of his kingdom. Flamininus then sought to win the goodwill of the Greeks with his famous proclamation of their liberation at the Isthmian Games of 196. To lend credibility to this proclamation, he successfully argued against senatorial opposition for the withdrawal of Roman troops from all Greece, including the strategically important fetters, the key garrisons of Acrocorinth, Chalcis, and Demetrius. Even before the Romans withdrew, the seeds had been sown for their re-entry into the east. As an active king, Antiochus III set out to recover the ancestral possessions of his kingdom on the western coast of Anatolia and in Thrace. In response to the Roman demand that he stay out of Europe, the king attempted to negotiate. When the Romans showed little interest in compromise, Antiochus accepted the invitation of Rome's former allies, the Aetolians, who felt they had not been duly rewarded with additional territory after the victory over Philip, to liberate the Greeks. Upon crossing into Greece, however, the king found no enthusiasm among the other Greeks for a war of liberation and was defeated at Thermopylae in 191 by legions under the command of Manius Acilius Glabrio. Antiochus returned home to gather a larger army. In 190, Lucius Cornelius Scipio was elected consul in Rome and was authorized to recruit a force for a campaign against Antiochus. Accompanying Lucius as a legate was his brother, the great general Scipio Africanus. In an attempt to avert war, Antiochus offered to accept the earlier Roman terms, only to find that the Romans had now extended their demands to keep Antiochus east of the Taurus Mountains of Anatolia. Unable to accept, Antiochus fought and lost to Scipio's army at Magnesia ad Sipylum in the winter of 190 to 189. In the following Treaty of Apamea, 188, the Seleucid kingdom was limited to Asia east of the Taurus range and was required to pay an indemnity of 15,000 talents and to give up its elephants and all but 10 ships. Rome punished its opponents, the Aetolians, and rewarded its supporters, notably Pergamum and Rhodes, which were granted new territories, including Greek cities, at the expense of the liberation of the Greeks. The consul of 189, Gnaeus Manlius Vulso, came east with reinforcements, took command of the legions, and proceeded to plunder the Galatians of Anatolia on the pretext of restoring order. The withdrawal of Roman legions this time did not entail the withdrawal of a Roman presence from the Hellenistic East. On the contrary, according to Polybius, the Romans now were displeased if all matters were not referred to them and if everything was not done in accordance with their decision. Continuing jealousies and disputes in the Greek world offered Rome opportunities to adjudicate and ultimately to intervene once again. In the Peloponnese, the Achaean League was at odds with Sparta, wishing to bring Sparta into the league and to suppress the radical social program of its king, Nabis. Flamininus in 195 supported the independence of Sparta, but in 192 the Achaean leader, Philopoemen, induced Sparta to join the league with a promise of no interference in its internal affairs. When an infringement of the promise prompted the Spartans to secede, Philopoemen in 188 led an Achaean army to take Sparta, kill the anti-Achaean leaders, and force the city back into the league. Although the Senate heard complaints, it took no immediate action. Then, in 184, the Senate reasserted its own terms for settlement but was circumvented by Philopoemen, who reached a separate agreement with the Spartans. The independent-minded Philopoemen died the following year in a campaign by the League to suppress a revolt of Mycenae. His death led to a change of leadership, as the pro-Roman Callicrates, regarded by Polybius as a sycophant, began a policy of obeying Rome's every wish. Meanwhile, tensions between Rome and Philip were increasing. Philip had supported Rome's war with Antiochus in the hope of recovering Thessalian and Thracian territory, but in this he was disappointed by the Romans. They did, however, return Philip's younger son, Demetrius, taken to Rome as a hostage in 197, a reward with tragic consequences. During his years as a hostage, Demetrius had made senatorial friendships, which aroused suspicions at home that the Romans would prefer to see Demetrius rather than his elder brother, Perseus, succeed Philip. Philip ordered the death of Demetrius in 181 and then died in 179, leaving his throne to Perseus, the last king of Macedonia. Perseus's activism started a stream of complaints to the Senate from neighboring Greek powers from 175 onward. The king's real intentions are unclear. Perhaps Polybius was right that he wished to make the Romans more cautious about delivering harsh and unjust orders to Macedonians. The Senate listened to the unfavorable interpretations of Perseus's enemies, who claimed that the king's actions revealed an intent to attack Rome. Like his father, Perseus campaigned to extend Macedonian power to the northeast and south and marched through Greece as far as Delphi. He solicited alliances with the Achaean League and other Greek states, which some of the leaders hostile to Rome would have liked to accept. He arranged dynastic marriages with other Hellenistic kings, taking the daughter of Seleucus IV as his wife and giving the hand of his sister to Prusias II of Bithynia. Although these actions could have been viewed as the behavior expected of a Hellenistic monarch, Eumenes of Pergamum suggested to the Senate that Perseus was preparing for war against Rome. After the Senate decided on war, it sent Quintus Marcius Philippus to propose a truce and to give Perseus false hopes of negotiation in order to allow the consul of 171. Publius Licinius Crassus, to land his army on the Illyrian coast unhindered, a ploy decried by some older senators as the new wisdom. Perseus's initial success against the Roman army in Thessaly in 171 did not alter the massive imbalance of power, and the Romans again refused the king's offer to negotiate. Over the next 3 years, Roman commanders devoted more effort to plunder than to the defeat of Perseus. In a notorious incident, the praetor Lucius Hortensius anchored his fleet at Abdera, a city allied with Rome, and demanded supplies. When the Abderatans asked to consult the Senate, Hortensius sacked the town, executed the leading citizens, and enslaved the rest. When complaints reached the Senate, weak attempts were made to force the Roman commanders to make restitution. In 168, the experienced Lucius Aemilius Paulus was re-elected consul and sent out to restore discipline. He quickly brought the Third Macedonian War to an end by defeating Perseus in the Battle of Pydna in June 168. Perseus was deposed, and Macedonia was divided into 4 republics, which were forbidden to have relations with one another. They paid tribute to Rome at half the rate they had previously paid to the king. In 167, Rome proceeded to punish those who had sided with Perseus, such as the Illyrian Genthius, those whose loyalty had wavered, such as Eumenes, and even those who had contemplated acting as mediators in the war, such as the Rhodians. In Illyria, Paulus, on instructions from the Senate, swept through the countryside enslaving 150,000 inhabitants from 70 Epirote towns. In Achaea, 1,000 leading men suspected of Macedonian sympathies were taken as hostages to Rome. Among them was Polybius, who befriended the noble Scipionic family and wrote his great history of the rise of Rome with the aid of privileged access to the views of the senatorial leadership. Eumenes was refused a hearing before the Senate on his visit to Italy. His fall from favor prompted his enemies to dispute his territory, and in 164 a Roman embassy in Anatolia publicly invited complaints against the king. Rhodes had thrived as the leading trade center of the eastern Mediterranean, using its considerable resources to control piracy, but now Rome undermined its economy and power by making the island of Delos a free port, thereby depriving Rhodes of its income from harbor dues. Territory in Lycia and Caria on the mainland, granted to Rhodes in 189, was now taken away. But the far harsher proposal in the Senate to declare Rhodes an enemy and to destroy it was opposed by senior senators such as Cato the Censor and was voted down. As a result of the weakening of Rhodes, piracy became rampant in the eastern Mediterranean. The young Julius Caesar was captured by pirates. During the next century, Roman senators did not find the political will to suppress the piracy, perhaps in part because it served their interests. Pirates supplied tens of thousands of slaves for their Italian estates and disrupted the grain trade, thus raising prices for their produce in Rome. The arrangements of 167 served the Roman policy of weakening the powers of the eastern Mediterranean. In the previous year, Rome had also intervened to stop Seleucid expansion into Egypt. In a famous episode, the Roman ambassador Gaius Popilius Laenas delivered to Antiochus for the Senate's demand that the king withdraw from Egypt. When the king requested time for consultation, Popilius drew a circle around the king with a stick he was carrying and told him not to leave the circle until he gave his response. The king was astonished at this occurrence and the display of superiority, but, after a brief time, said he would do all the Romans demanded. The power vacuum fostered by the Romans was not ultimately conducive to stability. An adventurer, Andriscus, claiming to be descended from the Macedonian dynasty, was able to enter the Macedonian republics without serious resistance. He was successful enough in raising an army to defeat the first Roman force sent against him in 149 under the command of the praetor Publius Juventius Thalna, who was killed. A second Roman army under Quintus Caecilius Metellus defeated the pretender in 148. With the death of Callicrates, leadership of the Achaean League passed to Critolaus and Dias, outspoken proponents of Greek independence from Rome. In 147, a Roman embassy was sent to intervene in the affairs of the League by supporting the secession of Sparta and also by calling for the detachment of Corinth and Argos from the League. The embassy provoked a violent reply. When further negotiations were blocked by Critolaus, Rome declared war on the Achaeans in 146, citing as reason the ill treatment of their embassy. Metellus, now with the appellation of Macedonicus, having delayed with his army, marched against Critolaus and defeated him in Locris. Then Lucius Mummius Archaicus, consul of 146, took over the command and defeated Dias and the remaining Achaeans. The Senate ordered Mummius to teach a lesson to the Greeks. The venerable city of Corinth was sacked, its treasures taken to Rome, and its buildings burned to the ground. The nature of Roman domination in the East began to change decisively after these wars. In place of influence through embassies, arbitration of disputes, and the occasional military incursion came direct rule. Macedonia was annexed as a province, to be governed and taxed by a Roman proconsul, who also watched over the Greek cities to the south, where the leagues were disbanded. Farther east, the kingdom of Pergamum was added as the province of Asia, as a bequest to the Roman people from Attalus III in 133.